Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
In less than 500 carefully considered words, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt told the United States Congress, and indeed most of the nation, what had happened at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, just under 24 hours ago. Before Sunday morning, the men and ships of the United States Navy's mighty Pacific Fleet had slumbered peacefully here, untouched and unthreatened by the war that already was ravaging Europe. Few, if any, in this idyllic setting had reason to suspect that dawn would bring, at 7:53 a.m., 181 fighters and bombers of the combined naval and air forces of the Emperor of Japan that had come out of the rising sun in two meticulously planned and carefully timed waves. In just 2 hours, they had sunk 5 of the 8 battleships in the harbor and crippled the other 3. They had also badly damaged 11 smaller ships, including cruisers and destroyers. And they had killed 2,403 American servicemen, including 1,177 who went down with the USS Arizona when she was struck with a 1,700-pound bomb that exploded her powder magazine. They had wounded almost 1,200 more. By all accounts on this morning, the attack had been a complete success. The United States, which had since the close of the Great War stubbornly steered a course of non-participation in world affairs, would soon be involved in another world war. But though it was not yet evident in the chaos and carnage of this Sunday morning, the leaders of the force that carried out the attack on Pearl Harbor had made critical errors for which Japan would be made to pay a heavy price. Japan had spent more than half a century preparing for war with the United States, and she had struck a devastating first blow. But she had stopped short of the coup de grace, and her fate already was sealed. As the pilots who carried out the second wave of the attack on Pearl Harbor returned to their carriers, jubilant at the damage they had done and confident in their victory, their commanding officers were engaged in heated discussions over what to do next. From his flagship, the Hiryu, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commander of the 2nd Carrier Division, sent a message to Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the Pearl Harbor Striking Force, that he was ready to launch another attack. The pilots gathered on the flight decks of their carriers and waited for the command to attack again. Admiral Nagumo was questioning Lieutenant Commander Mitsuno Fuchida, who had been chosen by Admiral Yamamoto to lead the airstrike. Yes, Commander Fuchida reported, he believed the battleship force of the U.S. Pacific Fleet was completely immobilized for 6 months. No, he admitted, the American carriers were not at Pearl, as the Japanese High Command had hoped. The 3 carrier task groups were at sea, possibly nearby. Admiral Nagumo had never liked the Pearl Harbor attack plan, and now, with the seas beneath his ships getting choppy and his heart heavy with the fear that one of the American carrier groups might stumble upon them if they stayed long enough to launch a 3rd attack, he ordered his carriers to stow their planes and come about for the return trip to Japan. Nagumo and his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Ryunosake Kusaka, who also had been opposed to the surprise attack, believed that they had accomplished their mission. They had, they believed, prevented the United States from waging war in the Pacific for at least 6 months, and assured the safety of the attack forces on their way to attack Malaya and the Philippines. Best of all, they had done this without risking their own carriers. But by not staying to exploit their victory, a mistake which puzzled even the American command, Nagumo and Kusaka left the Americans in better shape than they realized, and their superiors in the Japanese military establishment knew it even before the attack force returned home in apparent triumph. Fortunately for Japan, her naval and air forces were on the move elsewhere in the Pacific. The attack at Pearl Harbor was just the opening salvo in what was a well-planned and devastating 3-pronged attack. For the next 72 hours, the Japanese would unleash their military forces all across the Pacific. On the night of December 7th, Japanese troops landed at Singora in British Malaya, losing only 9 men. Early on December 8th, Japanese planes and warships attacked Davao and Guam. Bombers from the Kwajalein Atoll base in the Marshall Islands, given to Japan by the League of Nations, bombed Wake Island. The Japanese Air Force also bombed Singapore and the nearby naval base. Vice Admiral Mineichi Koga surrounded the island of Hong Kong with his ships while planes from Japanese bases in South China bombed it repeatedly. Before overrunning Shanghai, Japanese naval forces sank the HMS Petrel after the crew of the British gunboat refused to surrender, then boarded the USS Wake and imprisoned her crew. The Japanese army in Indochina crossed the border into Thailand and took over the country without a fight by diplomatic accommodation. While the bombs rained down on Hawaii, Navy pilots of Japan's 11th Imperial Air Fleet, based on Formosa, spent a fitful night beside their planes waiting for a heavy fog to lift. Their assignment? To bomb the critically important American airfields 500 miles away in the Philippines, part of the coordinated attack on U.S. forces stretching across the Pacific from Pearl to Wake Island, Guam, and Manila. At 6 a.m., tension on Formosa was growing thicker than the fog. A loudspeaker blared the news of the attack on Pearl Harbor, sending the Japanese forces into resounding cheers. Now their mission had acquired an added risk. The Americans would no longer be surprised and surely be waiting in strength. The fog lifted, and by 10:45, December 8th, Philippine time, 108 Japanese bombers and 84 Zero fighters were airborne and speeding toward Luzon, the largest island in the Philippines. While General Douglas MacArthur is by most historians considered one of the most capable military leaders the U.S. ever produced, an American Caesar, he had his failures. One of the most devastating was the manner in which he conducted the defense of the Philippines. There, despite the fact that MacArthur had more than half a day's warning, the Americans were caught flat-footed. Immediately upon learning of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Major General Lewis Brereton, commander of U.S. Air Forces in the Philippines, wanted permission to launch his bombers against the Japanese on Formosa. The Americans did not have adequate maps, and the B-17s would have to go without fighter protection, but Brereton believed that his crews could inflict heavy damage on the Japanese bases. Brereton sent his planes aloft as a precaution and waited for a reply to his request. Hours passed with no reply from MacArthur. Then, shortly after 10, the OK came. Brereton called his planes to land and refuel. It was then at about 12:20 p.m., while they were lined up in neat rows, that the first bombs dropped. The damage was devastating. The Japanese surprised the majority of the U.S. Far East Air Force on the ground, destroying most of its B-17 bombers and P-40 fighters. Japan's program for conquest in the Pacific had begun with stunning effect. The United States naval and air power in both Hawaii and the Philippines had been dealt a series of terrible blows. On the same day, the vital outposts of Guam and Wake Island were bombed, and invasion was sure to follow. Guam's end was swift. In the hours after midnight on December 10th, some 5,400 Japanese Marines and infantry splashed ashore. By dawn, they had reached the governor's palace, where a brief firefight took place. As the sun came up, the Americans ceased fire, and the 427 U.S. Marines surrendered. On that ignominious note, the only piece of United States territory in the 3,000-mile stretch of the western Pacific between Wake and the Philippines was lost. Wake was next. The first attack on Wake occurred just before noon on Pearl Harbor Day. Upon hearing of the attack on Pearl by radio, the island commander had his bugler sound call to arms. The Marines grabbed their rifles, and 4 Grumman Wildcats took off on patrol. Then a squall came up, and the patrolling Wildcats missed a flight of 36 enemy planes that came in under the clouds. The Japanese strafed the airfield on Wake, blowing up 7 of the fighters still on the ground. But with the remaining planes, the Flying Leathernecks managed to shoot down a dozen of the enemy bombers. Shortly after midnight on December 11th, Marine lookouts saw a blinking light on the horizon, and by dawn, a Japanese invasion force was wading ashore. The Marines waited until the last minute to open fire. Their 5-inch guns crippled the Yubari, flagship of the invasion force, and sunk 1 destroyer. A second destroyer was hit and sunk by 100-pound bombs from the surviving Grummans. In a 45-minute battle, a few hundred Marines had beaten back an entire Japanese invasion fleet. The remaining Japanese forces turned tail and sailed back to their base at Kwajalein. The Americans had lost only 1 man. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the Japanese had been turned back. The attack on Wake was one of the most humiliating defeats of the Imperial Navy during the war. But the Japanese would be back in force. The Americans were not the only ones facing Japanese assaults. On December 10th, 84 bombers and torpedo planes dispatched from a Japanese airbase in Indochina with 1,000-pound bombs located the new British battleship Prince of Wales and her companion vessel, the battle cruiser Repulse, at sea north of Singapore and sank both in less than an hour. British naval power in the east was broken. Though they had not delivered the finishing stroke at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had put the Americans and the British on their heels in the Pacific. The Japanese Navy had been at war constantly since 1937, and it was in prime condition for war. The Americans and British would not be ready for months. When they were ready and set about the task of dislodging the Japanese from all the territories they had claimed in these 72 hours, they would find the going very rough indeed. For his part, Admiral Yamamoto knew within hours of the strike that it had failed to achieve its objective. It was just before 9 in the morning on December 8th, Tokyo time, when he received word that Nagumo had stowed his planes and turned the carriers for home. In his diary, Yamamoto wrote that he had been prepared to lose 2 of his aircraft carriers to achieve total victory at Hawaii. The American carriers, Yamamoto knew, were the real prizes, and Nagumo had not bagged them. Yamamoto knew that modern warfare already had made battleships obsolete, and that the 3 American carrier groups still at large in the Pacific posed a much greater threat than Japan would have had to fear from the great ships now lying in the mud or aflame in Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto, a poet and fanatical bridge player, summarized his feelings with a bit of dark humor in a waka, a classical Japanese poem of 5 lines. "What I have achieved is far from a grand slam. Let me in all modesty declare, it is more like a redoubled bid just made." Adolf Hitler received the news of the bombing of Pearl Harbor in his remote underground bunker, the Wolf's Lair, some 450 miles northeast of Berlin. When press officer Heinz Lorenz handed him a cable containing the news, the Fuhrer slapped his thigh and shouted, "The turning point!" Hitler could hardly contain his ebullience when he related the news to Generals Alfred Jodl and Wilhelm Keitel. "Now it is impossible for Germany to lose the war. We now have an ally who has never been vanquished in 3,000 years. Roosevelt must be smashed. It has been the major accomplishment of the Japanese that they have destroyed the myth of American superiority from the start." But Jodl and Keitel, like the other generals in Hitler's command, had misgivings about the news from Hawaii. They all had hoped that Japan would enter the war, but in Siberia and against the Russians, to take some pressure off the Wehrmacht on Germany's eastern front. Though General Heinz Guderian's 63rd Corps was entrenched in the suburbs of Moscow, it, like most of Army Group Center, was all but immobilized by the snow and cold. Most of the air support with which the German armies had started the Russian campaign had been transferred to North Africa, where British forces were doing a good job of keeping much-needed supplies from getting through to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps. In the first hours after Pearl Harbor, Guderian began to move his troops back from Moscow, suffering heavy losses as he went. If he knew any of this, the Fuhrer chose to put it out of his mind. Celebrating the Japanese victory, even his closest generals believed would avail the Reich very little. They were more concerned with the Russian winter than with Japanese military action in the Pacific. Japan's action, all the generals agreed, promised no help to the armies on the Eastern Front. For them, rather, it evoked the specter of America's entry into the war on the side of an enemy who already was gaining the upper hand. On December 8th, before leaving for Berlin and a ceremony honoring Japan's ambassador Oshima for his country's success, Hitler sent word to Admiral Dönitz of the Kriegsmarine to have his U-boats begin attacking American ships wherever they found them. German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop knew that Hitler was preparing to declare war on the United States. Just minutes before an afternoon appointment with the Japanese ambassador, during which he knew Oshima would press for that declaration under the terms of the Axis Pact, Ribbentrop reminded the Führer that Germany was not obliged to do so. Because Japan had attacked the United States, Germany was not bound by the accord to enter the war between the two nations. Hitler would hear none of it. If we do not stand on the side of Japan, he told his minister, the pact is politically dead. That was not Hitler's main reason for wanting war with the U.S. It had, he told Ribbentrop, already been a significant force in the war. What's more, Hitler knew, America's leaders believed it could not be ready to fight a major war until at least 1943. The time to strike was now. On December 11th, Hitler addressed the Reichstag, calling Roosevelt a criminal backed by millionaires and Jews who had provoked Japan into attacking the United States. Before Hitler could even say the words he had summoned them to hear, the members of the Reichstag rose and cheered him wildly. Back in the Wolf's Lair, the generals were astonished at the swift declaration. They knew that the Reich could not possibly widen the scope of its military commitment with any hope of success. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was more direct. Privately, he called Hitler's headlong rush to war with the U.S. Selbstmord, suicide. As Japan's naval air forces were descending upon Pearl Harbor, about to deal the blow that would shake the United States forever from her isolationist mentality, the government of the United States was, with some exceptions, at lunch. Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was entertaining several dozen lunch guests in the Blue Room. The president would not be able to attend, she told her guests, because the news from Japan was very bad. The timing of the First Lady's comment was coincidental. She meant only that negotiations between the two nations were keeping the president too busy for socializing. No one in Washington had yet heard about the awful events in Hawaii. It was 1:30 p.m. when news of the attack first began to reach Washington. In a hallway near the office of Navy Secretary Frank Knox, an aide found Secretary Knox on his way to lunch and handed him an 8-word message from Ford Island, Hawaii. Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is no drill. Knox's first reaction was disbelief. This must be the Philippines. Another aide assured the secretary it was not. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover received the news by telephone from his Honolulu bureau chief, Robert L. Stivers. I know Japanese planes when I see them, he told the director, then held the phone out the window so Hoover could hear the bombs dropping on Pearl. At the office of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, General Counsel Edward Ennis was writing contingency plans for dealing with aliens in the United States in the event of war. A staffer in the Honolulu Immigration Office called Ennis with the news just before 1:30. Ennis sat down and drafted an emergency proclamation for the president to sign. It authorized the FBI to question and search any of the 117,000 Americans with Japanese heritage living on the West Coast who might be suspected of being sympathetic to Japan. The emergency order would give the FBI the power to seize any contraband property belonging to these people. everything from radios to cameras to books and magazines would be considered fair game. Before the President had even seen the order, let alone signed it, INS offices on the West Coast would be notified that they had summary power to apprehend any potentially dangerous Japanese aliens. It took Secretary Knox more than a quarter of an hour to reach President Roosevelt with the news. "Mr. President," Knox said, "it looks as if the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor." Roosevelt's first reaction was similar to Knox's. "No," was all he said before Knox hung up. To staff in his office, Roosevelt said, "It was just the kind of unexpected thing the Japanese would do. At the time they were discussing peace in the Pacific, they were plotting to overthrow it. If this report is true, it would take matters entirely out of my hands." Then he picked up the phone. Just after 2 p.m. D.C. time, 8:30 a.m. Pearl time, the President called Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson to tell him they have attacked Hawaii. They are now bombing Hawaii. At 2:05 p.m., Roosevelt reached Secretary of State Cordell Hull at his office. Japan's ambassador, Kichisaburo Nomura, and Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu had just arrived at Hull's office more than an hour late for a 1 p.m. appointment with Hull. Roosevelt told Hull about the attack on Pearl Harbor and instructed him to say nothing of it to the two Japanese diplomats. Hull was to receive the two formally and coolly, hear what they had to say, and bow them out. On instructions from his government, Ambassador Nomura had called only that morning to make the appointment. Tokyo had sent him what amounted to a 14-part ultimatum to the United States government on its policy toward Japan, and ordered him to deliver it at precisely 1 p.m. Washington time, which was 7:30 a.m. in Hawaii. As it happened, it had taken much longer for the document to be prepared than either Tokyo or the Japanese embassy in Washington could have anticipated. By the time Nomura arrived at the State Department with the message in hand, the first wave was over, and official Washington already had heard the news. What's more, the U.S. State Department already had intercepted, decrypted, and read the contents of the message as they were being sent to Nomura. Secretary Hull's anger had been building for some time when he received the Japanese diplomats. He pretended to read the document they handed him and then asked Nomura, "Why 1 o'clock?" Hull knew, of course, what Nomura did not, that the original appointment time was half an hour after the bombing had begun. Nomura said, "I don't know the reason, but I was so instructed." Still pretending to read the document, Hull began shouting at the two Japanese. The message, he told them, was crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions on a scale so huge that I never imagined until today that any government on this planet was capable of uttering them. Then he ordered them out of his office. It took very little time for news of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor to reach the American public. At 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, the Mutual Broadcasting System was announcing the news to its radio listeners. One of them angrily called the network switchboard in New York. He had heard and believed Mutual's 1938 broadcast of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds and wanted the network to know he wasn't about to be taken in a second time. At 2:31 p.m., CBS announcer John Daly interrupted regular programming with word of the bombing. "The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air," the president has just announced. "The attack was also made on naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu." At Radio City Music Hall, crowds of moviegoers who had come to see Cary Grant and Joan Fontaine in Suspicion got the news from the ticker tape machine in the lobby. Some rushed home immediately. Others went on into the hall to watch the film. Back in Washington, a sellout crowd was on hand at Griffith Stadium, where Slingin' Sammy Baugh was leading the Washington Redskins to victory over the Philadelphia Eagles. It was a Sunday after all, and then, as now, Sunday afternoons were for football games. In the Griffith Stadium press box, Associated Press reporter Pat O'Brien received this message from his office by teletype: "Japs just kicked off. War now." At the start of the second half, a reporter sitting in the stands got a telegram from his wife addressed to Section P, top row, seat 27, opposite 25-yard line, east side, Griffith Stadium. The note said simply, "War with Japan, get to office." After every play, announcements from the loudspeakers called generals and admirals in attendance, as well as the resident commissioner of the Philippines, to report to their offices at once. Yet Redskins owner George Preston Marshall and the stadium management refused to tell the crowd what had happened. Marshall said, "We never broadcast non-sport news at the stadium." A headline in the next morning's Washington Post would read, "War's outbreak is deep secret to 27,702 Redskin game fans." In Holyoke, Massachusetts, Major Curtis LeMay had just finished a day of training new members of his 34th Bomb Group on their 2 B-17 Flying Fortresses when he turned on the radio in his car to listen to the Giants game. Hearing the war bulletins, LeMay said he felt relief that the waiting was over. Charles Lindbergh heard the news of the Pearl Harbor bombing at his retreat on Martha's Vineyard. Lindbergh, a leading voice for American isolationism and a strident opponent of President Roosevelt's Lend-Lease arrangement to help Great Britain fight the Nazis, could not believe that Japan was capable of such a victory. His first thought was that the only possible reason for the success of the Japanese attack was that Roosevelt had sent so much of the U.S. Navy to the Atlantic. The president had left Hawaii defenseless in order to help Churchill, and the devastation at Pearl Harbor would surely convince America to stay out of the war. Just as the Japanese had done, Lindbergh badly misjudged the reaction of the American people. Within hours, all across the United States, Americans took to the streets, demonstrating their anger at the Japanese and their desire to go to war. On the West Coast, tensions ran high as the residents braced for a possible Japanese invasion. They began to regard their Japanese-American and Nisei neighbors suspiciously. In San Pedro, California, and nearby Long Beach, the tuna fleet, which was mostly Japanese-Americans, had set out to sea in the morning, then abruptly turned back to port when they heard radio reports of the Pearl Harbor bombing. By 9 o'clock on the evening of December 7th, many of them were in the detention pen at Terminal Island, where more than 300 Japanese had been imprisoned after being taken from their homes and cars and boats. The next day, December 8th, at just after 12:30 in the afternoon Eastern Time, Sam Rayburn, the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, introduced President Roosevelt to a rare joint session of the House and the Senate. Wearing heavy metal leg braces, the President stood before the group of 339 congressmen and 82 senators and asked them to declare war on Japan.
The people of the United States have already formed their opinions and well understand the implications to the very life and safety of our nation. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
After Roosevelt's speech, the Senate voted unanimously for war. In the House, Only one person, Representative Jeanette Rankin, voted no. Afterwards, she said she did it because she did not want the world to think America was war crazy. The war, for which Japan had been preparing for more than 80 years, had come. And though there would be 4 years of struggle and millions of deaths before the conflict would be resolved, Japan already had lost. In the days and weeks after Pearl Harbor, all of Japan joined in the celebration of the Navy's great victory and of the coming, at long last, of war with the United States. The joy was tempered by the knowledge that no one in Japan could be sure of victory, but for the Japanese, victory was not finally the point. On the day after Emperor Hirohito's declaration of war was read to the nation, the writer Daigaku Horiguchi wrote, "The joy of fighting for the emperor and dying for him in battle is something a foreigner cannot understand, a joy that only we can experience." By 1945, a great many Japanese men, young and old, would experience that joy.